All right, so thank you all for being here. I've slightly changed the title from what David just mentioned. But anyway, so what I'm going to present is the result of a group which is comprised of Emilio Doe, Pam, so is Robert Goronek, Ethan White, and the focus is on data challenges and opportunities in the region. So I want to motivate this presentation by giving two examples. The first one is going to be focused on dams and development. So we are all aware, and it has been widely documented, the environmental impacts of hydroelectric dams in the region. But these dams not only cause environmental impacts, but also a lot of social, economic upheaval. So there are people that are resettled, there are livelihoods that impacted, fisheries. And so here's just a photo showing the protest when the Belo Dam was being built. However, dam proponents, they often talk about dams saying that, yes, there are all these impacts, but ultimately the dam's gonna generate development in the region. And the reason they say that is there are multiple ways that can happen. For instance, the dam construction company is gonna be investing heavily in the area by building schools, hospitals, improving sanitation systems. Which may or may not occur very well. But anyway, so there's also money that gets passed to the county that hosts the dam through tax of the energy, of the sales of energy. And finally, there's an influx of money from the federal government for compensation of lost land due to the reservoir. So what we wanted to do here was say, well, there are all these pros and cons against them. Can we try to figure out what's the net effect of dams on local development? And so to do that, we required some data. So we needed data on development indicators, and we needed those data prior to the dam construction and after the dam construction. So to have comparable data, we went to get data on development indicators from IBGE, which is a statistical agency in Brazil. And one of the issues is that if you're considering a relatively long time span, because the data are aggregated at the county level, if these county boundaries change through time, then it's really hard for you to make temporal comparisons. It's really complicated. Some indicators are not even available prior to dam construction. Not only that, if we are to answer this relatively straightforward question, we need to know which are the dams that exist, which seems to be a simple question to ask. But when you go to an Now website, they post all the dams that they have there. Some dams are said to be in planning phase, and you look in Google Earth, they are actually operating already. So we need to know which dams exist. We need to know where they are. We need to know when construction started. Oftentimes for these dams, we only know when they start to operate, but we don't know when they start to be built. And there's often a big gap between construction and operation date. So the whole purpose of this example is just to show that what seemed to be a really important question, but relatively straightforward to answer, turns out that it's not that simple. We had a postdoc that worked a full year to try to gather these data. Even but doing so, actually, we weren't able to get all the data that we wanted. Another example is regarding power lines. So this is the work of J.C. Hyde. She's a PhD student of mine. We were interested, we saw that a lot of people that talk about infrastructure projects in the region, they talk about roads, they talk about dams, they talk about waterways, and they also talk, well, with dams, there are the associated power lines. But we wanted to know more about these power lines, but we couldn't find much in the literature. So what we did, we thought, well, obviously this information is already readily available out there, right? So we went to the NL website and we got their shapefiles. We actually got two. They were in different places. It's NL dataset 1, NL dataset 2, and it's quite striking to see that. So you can see in green and blue that there are discrepancies between these data sets. They are not the same. There are pieces that are missing one, that are not in another. The geographical location of these power lines is different. And then we said, well, what do we do now, right? So at a minimum, if we're interested in infrastructure projects in the region, we need to know where these things are in space. And so we thought, well, maybe we can look at Google Earth and try to figure out. And that's what JC spent 8 months hand digitizing. And so this is the purple line. Now you can see there's substantial pieces of the power lines that were missing from these data sets. And we said, well, even before she started to hand digitize, so let's ask Anel for the actual data. I mean, they must have it somewhere, right? And they said, well, this is a a data set that's of national security importance, and we cannot share. So I'm very sorry. So yeah, so the interesting thing about this is you think, well, this should be available, right? And it's somewhat basic to know where these infrastructure projects are. And the importance is, take a look at that graph. That graph shows you the total length of the network for the 2 data sets that we had from the official source, and the one that JC created, which is almost 3 times the length, right? We can also think about, well, what's the total area that direct impact of these power lines? So here you have the sum of the total impact area of the reservoirs of dams, which is typically what we focus, because these are very visible and very concentrated, right? But it turns out that the power lines actually create much more impact, but they are diffuse in space, so it's much harder to quantify. So what this shows is that it's really tricky to get these data. So here, just to summarize and going beyond these 2 examples, is that just finding, organizing, and validating some of the data that's really critical if you want to address some of these conservation challenges is tricky, time-consuming, and expensive. And validating here is a really critical issue, because you'll find many data sets out there, but can you really trust them to then try to determine what's the impact of roads, dams, power lines, waterways, and so forth? So we had to go through considerable effort to make sure that the data was accurate. Oftentimes, research groups collect data, NGOs as well, which are often limited in space and time. And if you want to get the big picture of what's happening, it can be very difficult. So here, the typical metaphor where somebody's measuring is measuring the trunk and thinks it's a water hose. There's somebody that thinks it's a spoiled rice pudding, and so it's tricky. And so it's a pity that oftentimes we do things in a piecemeal way, and we can't really get the big picture. Another thing is there are many data sets. They're incredibly expensive to collect. They're time consuming, but unfortunately, once the paper is published, they are at risk of being permanently lost. So here, there's just a graph showing the information content, how it declines through time. You can imagine as the student changes her career, or if a professor retires or gets hit by a bus, whatever data that person collected that's not made publicly available is completely lost. This is a photograph that Emilio shared with me of all the theses and information that came out from the Forest Fragments project in Manaus.
That's a small part of them, actually. That's just one corner of the bookcase.
And you can imagine how much data is locked there that nobody has access to, right? And if you think about measuring impact, oftentimes the critical piece is really having the baseline. How was the situation before something happened, and then what was the impact? Now, this is all baseline data, but it's locked. We can't have access. You have gray reports from the government that we don't have access. It's really hard to get.
So the bird data and all the tree data are all in one place and accessible.
Yeah, no, that's
those
really
are the
good.
those are the 2 gold standards of forest fragments. Absolutely, you can get access to this.
Yeah. But others maybe are harder to get. Yeah, and I didn't intend to pick on the Forest Fragments project. Just saying that's an example.
My data, not all my data are archived.
So you can write it on a Post-it note, share it, and we'll have an opportunity to keep these guys going.
And so the other thing that I think is very pervasive, but we don't necessarily realize, is that oftentimes the research questions and things that we try to address are guided by which types of data are readily available. And that's, if you think about it, that's really not the way it should work. So there's this metaphor where the police officer is saying, is this where you lost your wallet? And the person is saying, no, I actually lost it somewhere, but the light is here. That's why I'm looking at here, because it's I can't really look where it's dark. So to some degree, we suffer from this, and ideally, things wouldn't be this way. Things would be, you have this pressing conservation challenge. Here's the data that you're going to need. Either it's available or not. If it's not available, we're going to go and collect it, right? But that's not always the way it happens, especially with 4-year degree programs, and you're pressed for time, and get things done. Oftentimes, research questions are framed depending on what data we know exists already. So in terms of advancing this and overcoming some of the challenges that I've described, our group came up with a couple of recommendations. So one of them, which I think is really critical but often not done, is making data publicly available. And so thinking about all these legacy data that are lost, and we think that it's really important that we take formal measures to encourage data sharing and archiving in public repositories. And there's a lot of conversation regarding, well, maybe people don't want to share because they fear of being scooped, but you can always deposit the data and have and just say, well, release the data after 5 years or 10 years, but at least you have deposited and it will eventually become available, so you don't run the risk of forever losing a data set. But we think that there's a role for stimulating data sharing for many of the actors here. So for instance, funders, they could financially support archiving data in repositories or publishing data papers. And it's important to realize that making data publicly available, it's not just something that you wish and you just put somewhere. There's a lot of effort actually that goes into documenting that data, and there's a cost. People don't do that for free in terms of archiving and keeping these things live. So we should be aware that there's a cost associated, and we should strive to support that. There's also a lot of funded research. Oftentimes they generate a lot of data, but these data are not made publicly available. So funders actually have a lot of leverage in terms of mandating that to happen. So it could be either from funded project, or even the government could mandate that a lot of their data, the data that they collect, be made publicly available. Universities are not free of any of the task of trying to encourage data sharing. So universities have a very important role in terms of teaching best practice of data collection, organization, and archiving. And finally, we could even say that perhaps requiring archiving as a condition of awarding a degree would be something potentially desirable. So that's one of our recommendations. The other recommendation is that going back to the metaphor of the person looking for his wallet where the light is, there are data that don't exist, but perhaps a group of us could unanimously decide that that's priority data to have. And so if that's the case, we should be able to identify, prioritize, and collect data that we think is going to be beneficial for the conservation community as a whole. And we think that doing this sort of with this process of identify what data we need, standardize collection protocols, fund the research group to collect the data, and then make these data publicly available is really important, and I think it can be done. One example here. This is a map of protected areas in the Amazon together with the power lines. You look at a map, and we've said multiple times in this workshop, 50% of the area of the Amazon region is protected, right? But how much, so it gives us to some degree a peace of mind. All right, so things look good. But how much do we actually know about these protected areas? Do we know what's the amount of support, financial support for each one of these protected areas? How has this changed through time? Has the limits of these protected areas decreased or increased? Has their status changed? We don't have consistent standardized products telling us what's happening to these protected areas. Do they just exist in paper but not in reality? So thinking about this, protected areas are really a key initiative to protect the Amazon, but we know very little about the things that already exist. So Emilio was sharing with me the struggle that a researcher went through to get data on the amount of support that protected areas received in the Cerrado region. He asked for Ibama. Out of 24, he just received information on 20, and it was incomplete. And so that gives you a sense of how little actually we know. This is another example here showing the work of Amazon regarding endogenous roads. So these, they are shown in gray. The endogenous roads are roads that are not they are not officially sponsored by the government. They are created by independent actors, loggers, or settlers. And what they showed, examining a relatively small region, was the extent of these endogenous roads. So if we were to think that that's a really critical threat to conservation, and we should be able to get together as a community, try to identify, well, then if that's a key data set, how do we collect that data set throughout the basin so that the conservation community can use that as a useful tool for policy making. So we think that a lot of those ideas could potentially be condensed in something that we call Amazonian Data Hub. And there's a lot of connection between some of the ideas that we are providing here with the first group that was talking about the Netflix, and maybe this is the better title. But the whole idea here, so the first thing is the generation of high priority, standardized, and validated data products. What do I mean by that? So there's been quite a big revolution that has happened with this, for instance, the Proteus project in INPI to map deforestation. What they do, they have these remote sensing products that they put out every year, and it updates, and you have this historical sequence of very standardized, validated products that have been used extensively by the research community. We think that, well, it would be great if we had similar standardized products validated and that are regularly updated, but on other things. What about protected areas? What about if we had similar data products on protected areas, on infrastructure projects, say power lines, dams, roads? If we had these things, we think that that would have a multiplier effect on research. So data like from NASA or for INPI, they are used by a very large group of research groups, and they have generated considerable knowledge. If we were able to generate similar standardized products on other themes, I think we would have a very strong effect as well. But I think that the Amazonian Data Hub would have to go beyond just providing the data, right? And one of the key things is really validated it. But it would also help researchers to prepare data for archiving. So it's not trivial just to say, well, we mandate you to make data available. It requires skills, it requires training. So ideally, this organization, or whatever this would eventually turn out to be, would have that capability of helping people to put their data out there and archive. Not only that, we often struggle to find the relevant data. Maybe the data are available, maybe in different data repositories, maybe in a particular sub directory of IBGE or whatever, and it's incredibly hard. So it's often based on myself talking to Ani, and Ani knows somebody that might have it. And ideally, there would be an organization that would help you to find data that might be buried somewhere. So in conclusion, we've gone through some examples of the data challenges that we face whenever we're trying to address many of these conservation problems in the region. Sometimes things that in the surface seem to be readily available and easy to get. When you dive deep and you look carefully at these data sets, they're not consistent, they're incorrect, and so there's a lot of work to be done there. We've talked about some opportunities of how to make this better and how to overcome some of these challenges. So ultimately, what we think is that creating this data trove is going to be really foundational. It's going to be very important if we're ever to think about evidence-based conservation and development policy. So we think that for instance, a lot of the parallel events that are happening are talking about, say, simulation models. Let's predict what's happening in the future. How are they going to do it? They rely on data. If we can't get the data in, there's no predicting the future. There's no evaluating the effect of different policies. That's really the basis. And unfortunately, there's still much work to be done in that regards. So that's what I had. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Dennis. So you can take your blue Post-it notes and add them to the list here. And after you post your notes, please come back to your seat, and I'm going to introduce what we're going to do for the next hour.
Não sei se bon.
Ça, c'est
Okay, thanks.